Hello everyone, today I wanted to talk about the new Gwent patch, the Mulligan update that was brought into the game very recently, because people keep asking me what I think of the changes. Do I like them? Do I hate them? Whatever. Long story short, I do really like this patch. There's so much that it changes in a good way, and very little negative to talk about, if anything. And I think that sentiment is shared by a lot of other people, which is really awesome. So yeah, if you want the short answer, I really like the patch, it's great. But I want to dive into sort of the reasons why I think this patch is great, why the gameplay feels a lot better now, maybe the issues before that there were that are now alleviated as a result of the patch. And yeah, give a bit of an explanation and some background to why I think this Mulligan change is so good, along with the other stuff that they've implemented. So, first things first, Mulligan Change, right? Everyone now has 6 mulligans across the game, 2 in each round, and 1 extra if you're on blue coin. Now, of course, before you had mulligans tied to the leader, the strength of the leader dictated how many mulligans they would have. Some leaders had 3, some leaders would have 2, 1, whatever, and these mulligans were used for the whole duration of the game, right? So if you used mulligans in round 1, they would be used up and not be available in round 3 or round 2. It doesn't work like that anymore. It's just simply you have these mulligans that you can use to fix your hand if you need to. If not, then don't use them. They don't carry over. You don't have to worry about spending them in round 1 if you don't want to. You can if you want, and you won't be at any disadvantage later on in the game. This is such a great change, guys. I mean, it's been suggested for a while, but really the impact that this has on the game is kind of maybe understated, even when we were arguing for it in the past. So I'm going to break down, yeah, why is this so good? So the first thing is, yeah, your games are more balanced, right? Because both players can now mulligan if they want. One player is not penalized for mulliganing maybe their dead witches or their roach out of their hand if they are forced to do that. They don't then have a fewer mulligans later on in the game, which, was always a problem. If one player had a really good starting hand, they would have extra mulligans later on in the game compared to their opponent potentially. And with mulligans translating into points effectively a lot of the time, you're getting rid of bad cards, replacing them with better cards, which get you more points. Yeah, this was just creating a lot of imbalanced games where draw RNG just decided a lot of stuff from the start. So that's out. That's just completely gone. You don't snowball an advantage just by keeping your mulligans anymore. If you keep your mulligans, you don't gain anything, so you may as well use them. And that just is such a liberating feeling. You feel like you can improve your hand, and you have to make that decision every time. It's not, well, I have no bricks, therefore I keep the mulligans for later. The decision is, okay, I have these mulligans, I can use them. Do I want to get rid of this card? How many points is that worth? Do I need to maybe get my other engine here, or do I want to get rid of this card because I won't play? All this stuff is enabled, and you have so much more thought going into the mulligans and all that stuff now, and that's just, yeah, really awesome. The next thing it means is the games and the decks are actually more consistent, and not overly consistent either, and I'll talk about the reasons for this stuff. So one feature of old Gwent, pre-Homecoming, was so many decks were able to fulfill their game plan. They were able to play and execute a strategy that was pre-decided, before the game had even started. Maybe you're playing a greatsword deck and you want to get big greatswords and revive them later. Maybe you want to play an alchemy deck and kill their stuff and then res your guys later. You get the idea, right? You could do these sort of strategies, have these big finishers which were working, and you could often, or if not always, find those. Now, in Gwent currently, you can do that again, and that feels really awesome. But there isn't too much consistency either. There's just kind of the right amount, which makes games not feel too samey, but at the same time, a lot of games, like if not, yeah, a lot of games, you can pretty much guarantee you'll finish a card. Maybe you're playing, I don't know, Stefan and Commander's Horn together. Maybe you're playing, just Unicorn Chironex and you get those in your hand simultaneously more often. Maybe you're playing Blue Marvin's Dream and a unit to kill their unit, and you can get that a lot of the time. There's just so many of these sort of cool combos and finisher effects, and your high provision cards feel a lot better to play with now because you're more likely to draw them at those points in the game that you need them. And that's just because you have more mulligans, right? With more mulligans, you're able to get rid of the cards you don't want, get the cards you do want. So you have more opportunities to sort of search for the cards that you want, and therefore more deck consistency. Your deck is able to achieve its game plan, a larger percentage of the time. Okay, so what else? I mean, there's even more that this change does. That's a good thing, right? So the additional aspect to the consistency issue is you're able to play more thinning cards now without getting punished as much, right? Previously, decks that had very low amount of mulligans, say Usurper with 1 mulligan, wouldn't be allowed basically to play things like Witches, because if they draw the Witches, they're in really big trouble. They already lost the game pretty much, having to use mulligans early on. So now, with a lot of mulligans available to you at a lot of points in the game, right, round 1, 2, and 3, you can afford to play thinning cards. And also, not only that, you can afford to keep thinning cards from round 1 into later rounds if you want to, at the cost of, maybe bricking your mulligans. Things like Witches, right? You can hold them into later in the game if you want to swarm the board, if you want to tempo out your opponent. You don't have to commit them in round 1. I can't explain how great this is, guys. I mean, it's like you just get so many more potential decisions that you can make, things that you can do in the game. You have so much more freedom to play as you want to play, rather than being shoehorned into one line of play, playing a Witches round 1, otherwise you'll lose because you're going to draw them and then waste your carryover, whatever. So now there's just so much freedom. That's basically what it boils down to. There's a lot more decision making in terms of the mulligans, in terms of thinning cards, putting them in your deck, you have freedom there. Playing them in round 1 or not, you have freedom there. It's just so great. And all this added consistency in addition to that just makes the game feel so much more like old Gwent. And I think it was probably the biggest issue, honestly, with Homecoming Gwent that has now been solved. And yeah, I think the lack of consistency combined with the lack of control over a lot of games where you were forced into one line of play, that was really taking away from the Gwent experience. Okay, but also, guys, there's not too much, tutoring of cards. There's not too many, like you only have 2 copies of bronzes now instead of 3. No blacklisting as well. And all of that means that the games are still varied. You're not always finding the exact same cards in the exact same situations. Sometimes you still get screwed over by not drawing the card you really needed. And that's good. I think that's good, in fact, because you don't have that complaint anymore of people finding the games always being the same, cards always being in their hand and then playing their strategy exactly the same way against the same deck every time. Now it's just varied, but not to a huge extent. You can still get some key parts of your combo or your deck's plan into your hand and execute that. So yeah, it just feels like a perfect balance, right, of consistency but also variety, and I really, really love that. I can't explain how great that is. Okay, now a little lesser point. This is kind of a subjective thing for me, but I do like that now you don't see the mulligans that the leader has used anymore, right? You used to be able to look at how many mulligans your opponent had left, and that could kind of clue you in on how good their hand was. Now, I feel like this took away a little bit from the skill aspect of the game. All you needed to do was like right-click their leader, and you could basically get loads of information on how good their hand probably was. And that felt a little bit cheap. I like the typical Gwent approach of you have to weigh how good your hand is, you have to weigh how good your opponent's hand probably is, you have to maybe take into account what they've played in the game and what they maybe would have in their deck, and you use all that knowledge together to kind of work out how strong their hand will be, whether you should then push around, whether you shouldn't. Instead of just looking at their leader, looking at their mulligans and then deciding, well, he used his mulligans, I guess his hand is good, I won't push. Or, well, he didn't use his mulligans, his hand can't be good, so I'm going to push. It just felt a bit cheap. Now, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. There were some mind games involved, and I know people might enjoy that aspect of the game. But for me, that is a nice little thing that's not a problem anymore in that sense. So, guys, I'm not even done. There's more good stuff. There's even more good stuff. So, the Overdraw change was actually, I kind of underestimated how cool this little change was. And while it isn't a big deal, really, it doesn't really change the core gameplay that much. It definitely helps to make the game feel a lot more intuitive. And this is particularly in round 2. Yeah, I just want to commend CDPR for finding this little change because it's so beautifully executed. It's like the perfect change to solve a problem that maybe people didn't even realize there was, but there was, I think Life Coach even maybe talked about this. It just feels a bit weird. Like, say for example, you're in round 2, your opponent has just won the round, won on whatever 6 cards. You were on 7 when you passed, so you now have 10 cards in hand. Your opponent has 9, right? So now your opponent is going to play a card, right? In the old Gwent, you would have to play down to 7 cards as, the enemy. They would have to do that. There's no reason not to. with the new system, with this overdraw change, meaning you don't burn cards that you overdraw. Instead, it turns into mulligans. You are actually incentivized not to play to 7 cards, but instead to, do the thing that you want to do. You can basically have the freedom now to not play down to 7 if you don't want to. You can go further than 7 if you do want to. You can pass on 8 cards, 7 cards, 9 cards. What I'm saying, guys, is it's so much more intuitive now. You are free to do whatever you want. You aren't punished for not playing down to 7 cards. And there's a little bit of nuance in that the player who is reacting in round 2, if they overcome their opponent after their opponent plays a card, they are actually rewarded by getting an extra mulligan charge into round 3, and that's just like such a cool little nuanced thing that I just love so much. It's just such a nice fitting way to kind of fix this problem that was a problem, but it was hard to detect. And yeah, big props to CDPR for that one, because it's so genius the way that they fixed it. So anyway, yeah, long story short on that one, there's added nuance to the gameplay. There's more freedom in round 2 now, especially to play or pass depending on what your deck wants to do, what you want to do, how good your hand is, etc. And there's just so much more intuitiveness. If I'm ahead of my opponent and my opponent passes, I can do the same. I don't have to play a random card to get down to 7 cards anymore, because that was so bonkers intuitive. Like, why would you want to play a card after your opponent has passed and you're ahead in points? You don't want to do that in Gwent. That's a weird thing to do. But now you can do it, and it feels so much more like Gwent in that sense, and I love it. So Overdraw Change, Mulligan Change, they help in so many ways. They're so good. I just can't, you can't, it's so hard to even describe how big of an impact these have on the gameplay and how good it feels. So there's not much more else to talk about now. Sihil being nerfed is cool, I guess. I don't really have much to say. It was a bit toxic to play against. Hopefully it sees some play in fringe decks or is reworked at some point. The provision balancing, we'll see how that turns out. I like that it offers more sort of deck building thought going into it. You maybe have to go, okay, is it worth these extra provisions to have a better leader? Do I need the leader synergy in my deck? Do I need this or that? I can play a value leader and have more provisions, or I could play a really strong effect and have a weaker deck. I love the deck building aspect to that, and sure, once the meta gets solved, then the deck building stuff won't be so much of a big fun part of the game, but it's still worth mentioning that that's really cool. And also, I just wanted to, this isn't even to do with the Mulligan update, but I think in the gameplay, it's really coming through to me right now, is the game actually feels a lot better than pre-Homecoming Gwent in many ways. I think this is partly actually due to some of the new mechanics in the game, hand limit, and the tactical advantage that you get on blue coin. Now, both of these things basically allow most decks, if not all, to be playing engines, and they are. And that's even in combination with the fact that you're only allowed 2 bronzes in your deck of each type. It means you don't just shoehorn in all of the best bronzes. You have to mix and match. You have to maybe go to engines, some pure value, some removal. So from a deck building point of view, that's really cool. And in the games, when you're playing engines, it's just such a great experience because there's so many little decisions that have a really big impact. Like, you have to maybe decide not to play your guy into their Marauder. You have to tactical advantage to keep your guy alive. Maybe you have to save an engine until their removal has been wasted and use your engine later. And there's just so many spots where you're able to play an engine. You can be rewarded for it, you can be punished for it, and yeah, equally you can play a tempo play, you can play a removal play. You have to maybe save your removal for their engines, right? Maybe you don't use removal early in the game because you want to keep it for their engines later. Maybe you don't want to play your engines early in the game because they'll be useful in a long round later on. Whatever. It just feels like there's so much sort of bluffing, counterplay, reactivity to your opponent. Yes, with some decks more than others, etc. And I'm sure, you can make the case that, okay, removal is maybe too strong or engines aren't strong enough, blah, blah, blah. So, but the point is, it just feels good to play with engines and have this sort of dynamic between you and your opponent, both trying to control the board, but maybe not control it too much because you need your control for later. And maybe you value this engine more than another engine of his, so you want to kind of kill that, but not this. And it's like, oh, it's so great. You're using knowledge of your opponent's deck, their cards on board, like what they might have, what you might have later on. You don't even know necessarily, and it just all comes together to make kind of that Gwent experience, but even maybe on even another level that we haven't seen before, with a lot more sort of interactivity, I guess you could say. Also, I've just been having so much more of those Gwent moments where you predict what your opponent has. This might just be because I've played more of the game than I had previously, on Homecoming patch, but it feels so good. You predict the opponent's plays, or you have a feeling of what their hand might be. You don't need to rely on that sort of checking their leader for mulligans and all that. It's just, okay, use my brain. What has he played? How many provisions has he got in his deck? Etc., etc. What could he have in his hand? Okay, what do I play around? I'm going to play around this card. I get rewarded for it. I get an extra amount of points. That wins me the game. Best feeling ever, guys. The Gwent feeling, I call it. But yeah, I've been having a lot more of those moments, and it just feels so great to know that skill can be rewarded in this version of Gwent. There's a lot of stuff to think about, and there's so much to play around, to think, to interact with in the game now, and it really, really makes me happy. Yeah, so that's pretty much my thoughts on the patch. I think it's really been a good one. It's improved Gwent in many many ways in my opinion. And I really am looking forward to the future again. I was a little bit pessimistic, especially with the arrival of Homecoming, but even if Gwent isn't going to be the most popular card game, which who can say what will happen in terms of popularity for the game? I do honestly believe that the game is a lot of fun right now, and I hope it continues to be in the future. I hope that updates continue to roll out, and I think, man, when this game gets new cards, new leaders, it's going to be so good. That's all I can say on that front. I think it's going to be really, really awesome. Yeah, hopefully CDPR have learned from their mistakes in the past. It seems like they have, judging from this update. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to it. Anyway, guys, tell me how you're feeling in the comments. I'll be reading those. And thanks very much for hearing my thoughts and listening to me ramble, as always. I will see you next time.